It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. Just if you email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our guest today is Richard Alexander Otto. Richard Otto. You can find him on Facebook. He's got several pages there for each of his books we'll be talking about today. The Hidden War, The Desecration of the Promise of America. There's another one called Rethinking America, Lies Masquerading as Truth, with a really cool picture on the cover, too, a bunch of young men here playing football. And another one, The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, How Secrecy and Security Diminish Our Liberty and Threaten Our Democratic Republics. And as you can hear, this is stuff that's right up our alley here. Mr. Richard Otto, are you there?
Yes.
Hey, thank you so much. Before we get into these books, tell us about yourself. Who is Richard Otto?
Well, essentially, I started my career as an attorney, except for a couple of years working for a firm in downtown Hartford and being a clerk for a couple of judges in the Hartford Superior Court. I was primarily a public interest attorney, a special public defender, and a child protection attorney for about 15 years. And then my wife and I decided to move up to the beautiful state of Maine, and I decided to change gears, and I became a case manager in a drug court, which I did for almost 13 years. And now I'm a pretrial case manager where I help people get out on supervised bail. And during this period, I wrote my 3 books.
You know, you're a very humble guy, because before you became an attorney, I'm looking at your bio over here on Amazon. You were a pathologist for 30 years, and then you started a whole...
No, that actually was my father.
Oh!
I won some awards as a legal attorney, but my father was the pathologist, and he also served in Vietnam, which I talk about I have some of his letters that he wrote back and what he was seeing while he was in Vietnam.
Gotcha. And you're the one that won the awards as a child advocate, though, right?
Yeah, I won an award from the Willimantic Juvenile Lawyers Association, and I won an award from a bar association. In fact, I think till this day, I'm the only child protection attorney that ever won that award. They normally give it to other types of law.
And what does a child protection attorney do?
I represented children, parents, grandparents, extended family members in the Superior Court for Juvenile Matters in Connecticut. And sometimes I was that attorney at law, meaning I was their legal representative, and sometimes I was appointed by the court to be the guardian ad litem, usually for children,
right,
to make sure that things were proceeding in line with what was in the best interests of the children or child.
Yeah, so often, especially in divorces, the kids have no advocate for their interests in the dispute between the parents. It's a very tragic situation. We just did a show about that just recently. You can find Richard Otto, too. He's done a 3-part appearance on That's Enough Out of You podcast with Bill and Sean, where he's gone over all his books, and he's had another appearance coming up to cover in detail much more than we can do here in 1 hour. I guess the first book was Rethinking America, Lies Masquerading as Truth.
No, actually, it was The Paradox of Our National Security Complex. That was my second book. The Paradox, actually, I got an English publisher, John Hunt Publishing, to publish that book, and they assigned it to their subdivision called Cronus Books.
Right, and that's the one that's under the name Richard Alexander Otto, if you're looking for that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
they were more formal in what they.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, because they're in England. Yeah, The Paradox of Our National Security Complex. Okay, so what did you discover when you were looking into our national security complex?
Well, I mean, the paradox is that what we're told that we spend about $1.4 trillion on national security matters, and of course the budget for the Defense Department is about now $940 billion. And essentially, a number I got from one of Chris Hedges' books I don't know if you know the former New York Times columnist, but he found out that we spend, if you project it out, $32 million an hour on war and the development of weapons. So the justification for all that is that this huge national security complex that Eisenhower warned us about in 1961 essentially is enhancing our liberty and our security and is spreading democracy around the world. And what I found, the paradox was, it wasn't spreading democracy around the world. In fact, we were overthrowing and sponsoring coups against social democrats and imposing on their people brutal dictators or military juntas, like in Iran, Guatemala, Indonesia, Brazil, the list goes on, Chile. And they're doing it to this day. In fact, since the inception of the CIA, for example, in 1947, under the passage of the National Security Act of that same year that Truman signed into law, the CIA has essentially been involved directly or indirectly with overthrowing 87 governments. So they're not spreading democracy around the world. In fact, we're an adversary to people that are sponsoring democracies. And the reason for that is you can't control someone who's independent and responsive to the needs of their people. But brutal dictators, you can basically bribe them, you can give them military equipment and assistance so they can maintain their power, and they reciprocate by doing what you want them to do, which is subverting leftist groups, fighting communism, terrorism, or whatever you want them to do, plus supporting corporate interests. And so they allow, companies like Standard Oil, United Fruit, Freeport Sulphur, or in modern times, British Petroleum and other big companies to go into these countries and exploit their resources and their labor, and the people get minimal benefits, if anything at all. For example, the Congo is one of the richest countries in the world if you look at their resources, and yet their people are destitute. And that's because of our involvement in their country. We were involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961. In fact, they killed him 3 days before Kennedy took power because Kennedy supported Patrice Lumumba, and Allen Dulles and his people wanted him out of there. And Kennedy didn't find out about it until he was called by his UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, about a month after he took office. And he was told that he was assassinated. And there's a famous picture done by Jack Lowe, who was the White House photographer at the time, who photographed him in a very timely manner while he was receiving the news. And you can see Kennedy is extremely horrified. His hand is going over his forehead and over his eyes, and he's distraught because he really wanted to help him, and he wanted to help with the UN efforts to make that country independent. So we've never really supported democracy abroad. And in terms of enhancing our liberty, they're not enhancing our liberty. I think any of us that know anything about what's going on with the NSA or the disclosures from Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks know that we live in a surveillance state. The NSA is collecting everything we do electronically, everything. And the CIA is not far behind. And so they are infringing on our liberty, not expanding our liberty. And in fact, they engaged these agencies with the assistance of the social media platforms such as Twitter. I don't know if you've read or had guests on talk about the Twitter downloads. Essentially, these agencies were either indirectly through NGOs like, certain, but they were connected with the national security state, and they were telling them what to suppress and what not to suppress.
Well, let me stop you for a second. Richard Otto, I'm going to put on my oil industry shill hat on, okay, and play devil's advocate for a second. Mr. Otto, we have to have our troops over there to stop the terrorists from coming here.
Well, you have to have a strong defense, and I'm not advocating for us not having a defense department and a budget that sufficiently provides for our defense. But what we're doing is defending an empire, not a republic. We're getting involved in everyone's business, and we're creating enemies. We're not getting rid of enemies. We're creating them. We're creating recruitment posters for these people. For example, when we went into Iraq and the weapons and mass destruction fraud and that Saddam Hussein was involved with Al-Qaeda and 9/11, we all know that those were lies. They basically destroyed that country. They made it worse than when it was under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, and 1 million Iraqis have died. In the process, we created ISIS, which is a worse and more extremist group than Al-Qaeda was. And they're all over the Middle East.
I tell you, you say how we're creating them. In many cases, we're literally creating them. We're literally creating. I forgot who it was. Colby or Casey's daughter was the lobbyist for the Taliban.
Yes.
Yeah, like we're creating these people in many cases. Hey.
Yeah, in Syria. We were supporting them because it's the principle: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so we were fighting them in Afghanistan, but we were supporting those same groups in Syria because we were against Assad. So, and then when you look at our security, which was really the gist of your question, they're not making us more secure. They're creating more enemies for us.
Yeah.
For example, there was a student from Yemen. I forget his name right now, but he was getting a university education over here and actually eventually became a U.S. citizen because he really liked the American people. And he would go back to Yemen. This was before the war. It was several years ago. And he would tell the people in the village that he grew up in that because they thought of when they thought of the United States, they thought of cruise missiles, drones, blowing up places. They thought of CIA agents running around, murdering people and stuff. And so they didn't have a very good image of the United States. And he basically told them that the American people were good, that America was a good country, and he was convincing them. And then a drone hit their village, and under the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Obama reported to the news media that they had killed a couple leaders in some terrorist organizations. But the people in the village knew that they'd also killed a whole bunch of innocent civilians that just happened to be in the area that were friends and family members. And they were extremely upset. And everything that young student had done was totally washed away by that one drone incident. They began to hate the United States and fear us. And so we're not developing respect or admiration as we did under the Kennedy administration. We're actually imposing our will on people and doing things that are more representative of our power, not our ideals.
Let me ask you something, Mr. Otto. You say that the average American is a good person. Can we really say that anymore? If we can stand by and watch, kids being put in cages by both Obama and Trump, we can stand by and watch the people of East Palestine when they train derailment. They're still suffering there till this very day. They can smell the chemicals as they walk around today with no help and with Flint, no water. Like you said, bombing these places over there indiscriminately. What's going on right now in the Middle East? Where we're watching these images.
Yes.
The most horrific images in our lifetime that we've ever seen on a daily basis. Okay, I'm 60 years old. I guess you're a little bit older than me. And I don't know about you. Today I went and made my cup of coffee. I went and made my breakfast. Why are we not on our knees in the streets crying, seeing what's going on around us that we pay for with our taxes?
Well, unfortunately, people don't know it, but we're the most propagandized population in the world. People talk about Russia and China, but Barack Obama, I don't know if you know this, but he signed an executive order during the latter part of his administration that allowed the CIA to propagandize directly the American public. And I don't know if you're familiar with RFK Jr.'s campaign, but he said that's one of the executive orders he's going to overturn. And so, corporate America basically controls, however you want to call it, corporate media, mainstream media, or legacy media. They control them, and so doesn't the national security complex. And so most of their advertisers are from pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, and the media doesn't want to alienate their source of income. So they go along with a lot of this stuff, and so Americans really don't know what's going on. And when I talk to people, and for example, I try to tell them about Russiagate. If they've been watching CNN and MSNBC 24/7, they look at me like I'm from Mars and I'm some sort of tin hatter that's spreading conspiracy theories. And their first reflex is that I'm a Trump apologist or a Vladimir Putin apologist. And they're very resistant to hear what I had to say, from the technical evidence, the testimonials, the whistleblowers. And, before we started this interview, we talked about Trump derangement syndrome. I think it's real. I think some people are so scared of Trump, they believe in all the media hype that he's the biggest monster that's ever come around, that they would support anybody, even people that don't represent any of their views, just to make sure Trump doesn't get into office. And so I think a lot of people they're not stupid, they're ignorant. They don't know what's really going on, and that's why I wrote these books. And in fact, there were a lot of things that I didn't know when I started researching these books. For example, I wasn't sure what happened to President Kennedy, somebody I admired very much, but I wasn't willing to accept the fact that maybe elements of my own government were involved in his assassination until I looked into it. And then I realized, oh my God, these researchers and these people have been saying that Lee Harvey Oswald, not only was he not alone, he didn't even fire a shot that day. Actually, the most of the evidence, if not the overwhelming majority of the evidence, supports their narrative. And that's why in my first book, the JFK assassination is a central part of the book, because it allowed me to see things that I didn't see before. I wouldn't have been able to understand Russiagate or the COVID narrative if I hadn't understood the dynamics and the context in which the Kennedy assassination was permitted to occur in our country, and that the rest of the government felt compelled to cover it up to protect the integrity of the government, so that we didn't look like a banana republic. And so when you understand the Kennedy assassination and realize that there are elements within our government that are willing to kill a popular president to make sure that their views, their dogmas, their ideology dominates Washington policy, then you realize they're capable of almost doing anything.
It's funny when you say that people would be willing to vote for anybody to keep Trump out. Well, they obviously did. They voted for Biden.
Yes, I don't want to offend your listeners, because
don't worry about that. Don't worry about that.
I've been saying that Biden is one of the worst presidents I've ever seen, and I knew that he had the onset of dementia before he was elected, and he's gotten worse. And yet there are people that I talk to that think I'm talking out of my head. I'm a conspiracy person, because on CNN they hardly ever talk about his episodes where he can't find his way off the stage, or he started talking about something that was completely irrelevant to what he was doing, or he totally forgot what he wanted to say. And it's heartbreaking that so many people don't understand that they didn't vote for the lesser evil. In fact, he's made our situation more dangerous. He's put us in a situation where he's taunting and provoking two powerful nations that have nuclear weapons in China and Russia, when he should be negotiating with them and trying to find a way, as Kennedy did, to resolve our differences.
Oh, boy. Well, there's so much there. It is tragic that as far as, these presidential representatives that we elect, and this is the only choice that we have, these two characters that are just totally despicable in every possible way, and their families as well, and their whole life history that they've done. But I noticed you mentioned RFK Jr. You think he's a plausible candidate? As far as
I don't agree with his analysis of what's happening in Israel completely. I mean, he has some points, but I don't think he empathizes enough with the Palestinians and their plight. But obviously what happened on October 7th, assuming there's some talk that the CIA and MI6 could have been involved, I don't know. I haven't researched it. But assuming that it was totally Hamas, I condemn the killing of innocent civilians, whether it's our country, Israel, or any country. But the response by Israel, I think, is by killing innocent civilians in Palestine that can't defend themselves while they're trying to get a few Hamas soldiers that are in these deep caverns and tunnels, I think is a horrendous policy. And I wish he would speak out more against it, but he hasn't. But he does recognize that this whole thing could, much like World War I, if you ever read Barbara Tuchman's great book, The Guns of August, all these entangling alliances could drag us into a regional war and then a world war if we're not careful. Because Russia's aligned with Iran, Iran's aligned with Hezbollah, Syria, Hamas, and the Israelis are aligned with us, Britain, and China's aligned with Russia. You could see how all these entangling alliances, they could all be dragged into a war that nobody really wants, and it could be Armageddon. And he at least recognizes that. But in terms of much of his other message, that the two-party system is not representing the American public anymore, the Democratic Party has gone against its traditions, it's pro-censorship, it's pro-war, it's pro coups and regime change operations. When I was a kid, they were demonstrating in the street against the FBI and the CIA, and now they consider them their buddy. So everything's been turned on its head.
But Mr. Otto, you do realize that there is still a left, and there's a left in this country that is not Democrat. They're far to the left of the Democrats, right? The people who are.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the people who were fighting in the streets. I was one of them. You mentioned before.
Yeah.
The NSA, and you said, when Edward Snowden popped his head up and told us what the NSA was, we all learned what the NSA was. I was about 17 years old when my friend Fred Gotbetter, who was a spokesperson for the Yippies, Youth International Party in New York City, pointed at a building and said, "Ed, you see that building over there on 30th Street with no windows? That's the headquarters of the NSA, and they can listen to everything you say on the telephone. Everything on every phone in the world is recorded in that building." So I knew about the NSA in high school.
Yes, and some of us that were familiar with our history knew about the NSA, but in terms of most of Americans, nobody knew who the NSA was until Edward Snowden.
Right, but my point is, though,
you're an unusual person.
Oh, unusual. I'd say that.
You're very educated on these issues, and it sounds like you've talked to a lot of authors that have researched these matters. But if I went out into my street here and I asked all my neighbors if they knew what the NSA was doing, I bet you 90% of them would tell me who the NSA, who are they? They wouldn't know about William Binney and Thomas Drake, who in the early part of this century were whistleblowers about the NSA and their massive surveillance programs that Edward Snowden ended up following up with WikiLeaks. But actually, I think it was. He worked with WikiLeaks, but I think he sent most of his material with the assistance of Glenn Greenwald to the Washington Post and the New York Times, who ironically won Pulitzer Prizes for some of that. And, yet Edward Snowden had to seek asylum in Russia.
Right. The point I was trying to make, though, is that there is a left, and the Democratic Party is not the left. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are both capitalists, and it appears to me that the issue we have with spending, these numbers you described, what was it, $30 million an hour, or whatever it was, $1 trillion here and $30 billion. I mean, what the hell? These numbers are beyond comprehension anymore. To exert our military force around the world. That's the motivation for that is capitalism. It's to make profit off of people suffering. The worst profit. And you worked in the family court. The motive there is profit. Profit over the lives of little children. And you've seen it firsthand. I know you have because I've seen it. Okay, that's the problem, man. Whether Biden is Biden capitalist or this Reagan, who's this guy? Trump capitalist. Okay, they're both capitalists, and they're both the problem.
No, I totally agree.
Oh, you do?
We live in a country with crony capitalism. I'm a Democrat, but I came into the Democratic Party as a young man because I admired the Bobby and Jack Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt. And even though there were Southern segregationists and things within the Democratic Party I didn't agree with, obviously, still there were a lot of people in the Democratic Party that I thought were decent, like Allard Lowenstein and Frank Church, and people like that. Who of course this guy from California, Congressman Ross, who fought for the Freedom of Information Act for 12 years until it finally got passed. But now the Democratic Party does not represent the working class anymore. They feed at the same trough that the Republicans do. And Jesse Ventura on the Jimmy Dore show basically indicated that it's politics today is a lot like pro wrestling. Yeah. The results of what's going to happen have already been decided, and they go out there and they pretend that there's a fight and there's two parties that have two different views, when really they've already decided on what's going to happen. And so it's just like pro wrestling. I hope it didn't ruin pro wrestling.
I think pro wrestling is a lot more real.
The victors before it occurs. Yeah. And so there is a left. Oddly enough, there is a progressive left that I consider myself, and there is a libertarian aspect to a lot of stuff, like Jim Garrison was, like Jacob Hornberger and Ron Paul, who tend to accept a lot of these narratives. For example, the JFK assassination, they have no problem believing that parts of the government killed JFK. And in fact, they've held conferences on their podcasts and their websites on the JFK assassination. And they believe the CIA was involved. And so there's an overlap there with the progressive left and libertarians, because libertarians are against war. They're against us in this interventionist policy that we've developed, and they're strong advocates, I should say, for fundamental constitutional rights, such as the First Amendment, which the Democratic Party used to be for, but apparently are not now. I mean, Joe Biden has been the biggest censor of people I've seen in my lifetime. Donald Trump right behind him, and even Barack Obama and George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, they're all doing the same thing. And so it's both parties are not representing the interests of the governed. They're representing special interests, corporate interests, and they're promoting an empire, not a republic. And in fact, we aren't a republic anymore. Princeton did a study in which they took into account a number of factors, including the type of legislation that was being passed, and they pretty much determined in 2014 that we were an oligarchy. Yeah. And I would say that we are basically a corporate oligarchy.
I would agree too, and even this empire benefits not you or me, because if they're paying the salaries of people in Ukraine, and you and I can't get medical care, and we have to step over the homeless on our streets here, this empire doesn't benefit us whatsoever, and which is really shocking. You think that they would make more of an effort to give us a little bit more bread, considering how much they're stealing off the top, But I guess
they've been so successful in their propaganda campaign that, with the exception, there's been quite an outcry in what Israel's doing in Palestine. There was 300,000 people recently in Washington, D.C., and so it's awakened a group that are very concerned about what we're supporting and fear that a wider war could develop out of this crisis. But essentially, the American people have been quiet, with exception to people like yourself. And there are people that are marching and are trying to get the word out. But it's not the same as it was in the late 60s when they were out in the street and they were burning the cities down. And it was pretty evident that there was a huge dissident movement that were very unhappy with the policies of Washington.
But even that was heavily manipulated and infiltrated by COINTELPRO. And I got to tell you something, Richard Otto, author of let me plug these books for a second. I'm talking to Richard Otto here. And I hate to, throw in my opinions too much into the interview, but there's just so much I want to say. Richard Otto is our guest. The Hidden War, Declaration of the Promise of America is one book. Another one is called Rethinking America, Lives Masquerading as Truth. Another one is The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, How Secrecy and Security Diminish Our Liberty and Threaten Our Democratic Republic. And as you can see, Mr. Otto is a very thoughtful man, and the books are extremely well reviewed. I don't think there's one that's under 4.9 reviews, and they're all very, very well reviewed. We talk about what we're seeing right now as this alleged this division over the Mideast conflict right now. Okay, this division we're seeing amongst people that we pass by in the street, people tearing down these missing posters and putting up missing posters like there's a missing kid here in America. I don't know how they're going to find a missing kid in America. And God forbid they should suspect that there's a Hamas hiding in Florida or Maine and you and I get bombed, okay, which seems to be the logical, their theory, right? You can just bomb anybody if there's Hamas is hiding there. But what I see here in this new division, it's like, unlike I've seen in my recent lifetime, this division between who supports Israel and who supports Palestine. And I think it's by design. I don't think it's to benefit us. I don't think this is an organic movement here. And I think it's to cause more division amongst us here in America. I think they're upping the division that we have here in America.
Well, it is a divisive tactic that intelligence use, and it also is a great diversion for the economic problems we're having in this country. Up to 80% of Americans live week to week. 63% of Americans couldn't come up with $1,000 to pay for a financial crisis that popped up. Many Americans, their jobs have been outsourced, and they've been forced to take jobs that pay an hourly wage with no benefits. And we're essentially run by a new set of rapacious robber barons that have created a modern Gilded Age. And the middle class that I grew up with in the 60s and early 70s, and the optimism that existed within that class, even though there was a lot of problems going on at the time, assassinations, the war in Vietnam, and Watergate, there still was a sense of optimism that is clearly reflective by the picture on Rethinking America. And that's what that's supposed to show. That picture is 1975, and that actually to the left is me. That's my good friend Richard Murdoch, and that's my brother in the background. And essentially, Richard and I, we were proud to be Americans.
Right.
We thought we were living in the greatest country, and football and everything. And we were full of vigor, and we were going to live forever. And the United States were the good guys, and I've obviously had to rethink that. But at the time, it existed because there was a large middle class, and it was becoming more inclusive, although I agree, begrudgingly so, because of things like Dr. King and Malcolm X and the Civil Rights Movement and other movements that were coalescing with that. And that, since the 80s, has totally been gutted. Our middle class is nothing like it was before. And in fact, there was a poll done about young people recently, and only 17 or 20% of them said that they're proud to be Americans. If you took that same poll of Richard and I when we were young adolescents, I think that poll would be in the 80s somewhere. So they've gutted our middle class in order to fund all their wars. And then they blame all our deficits on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, when those programs are actually programs that made our society more humane. And in fact, they stole trillions of dollars from Social Security to pay for these wars, to pay for all their pork barrel projects. That's why Al Gore, when he ran in 2000, one of his campaign messages was he was going to put a lockbox on Social Security funds, because that's what they've been doing. They were bankrupting Social Security.
Yeah, I remember Bush said he wanted to privatize it. Imagine that.
Yeah, of course they want to privatize it, and those tycoons in Wall Street, they'd get control over the money. And then if they screwed us and we had a 2008 collapse, everybody's retirement would go down the tubes. It's just insane. So like you, I think we live in a form of crony capitalism, and I think when America was at its best, it was kind of a hybrid.
Yeah, I got to tell you though, Richard, man, whenever I hear people say crony capitalism, you're making excuses here. Capitalism is based on greed and profit, okay? It's based on people not working. It's based on these people using their capital to work for them. These stockholders are going to sit home, that they inherited that damn stock to begin with. They're going to sit home and decide who works and who gets fired and who gets hired while they do no work. And we that's a leech off our system, man. That's baked in to the design of capitalism. It don't work, man. It don't work.
I agree with you to a certain extent. The Gilded Age, when there was no regulatory agencies and there was no oversight, and these robber barons basically got to a place where they had so much money they bought and paid for the politicians, and they controlled the government, they controlled the markets, they controlled labor. And you can see with the system we had, people were working basically in sweatshops. If you look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, they refused to put fire safety stuff in those buildings. And one of the buildings caught fire, and 143 women died. They basically were jumping out of windows on the 9th floor and splattering on the cement before they finally put in fire safety. But what I'm saying is that the hybrid that I'm talking about is you have capitalism, but it's heavily regulated by government. There are also some socialist influences, like you have in some of the social democracies in Europe, like Finland and Denmark and Holland and those countries, where you make your society more humane, and you make sure that corporations aren't raping and pillaging the countryside, and that everyone's paid a legitimate wage, and that labor is properly supported so that they can come to the table as an equal partner and receive the benefits that they are helping the company make.
You know, Richard, you're right. It would be nice to get more crumbs. But what I'm saying is, is I want to own the bakery, okay? I don't want more crumbs, okay? And let me tell you something else, man. You objected so passionately before to privatizing Social Security. Why do we have a privatized oil industry in this nation when 85% of the world has a nationalized oil industry? But in the United States, we have a privatized. The only other countries are like Russia and places where they have kings, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a king developing countries have privatized oil industry, and the United States, the country of gangsterism. Why don't you, as passionately as you reject the privatization of Social Security, or people will object to the sale of water? Nestle taking this water, they're selling it back to us. They're pumping the oil out from under my feet, under your feet, and selling it back to us, man. How do we allow that and call it crony?
Well, because there's corporate control over a lot of the power centers within our society, and the Wall Street is very much connected to what some people call the power elite, as C. Wright Mills defined it in the 1950s when he wrote that book called The Power Elite. He was a sociologist, or they, in more modern times, that Professor Peter Dale Scott helped coin. They refer to it as the deep state. And they've totally, we've never been a perfect republic. When our founders, there were many things that were very admirable about them, but they allowed slavery to exist. Yeah. Only white male property owners were allowed to vote. So there were a lot of things wrong with our founding, but essentially they did create a limited republic. And they made the Constitution flexible so that people could expand those privileges if that's what the generations wanted. And so we've always had an opportunity to reach the promised land. We've always had an opportunity to fulfill our ideals and actually become a true republic. And we've never really reached it because we've had these powerful forces that have undermined these progressive movements, such as the one in the 30s with labor, which, by the way, was full of communists, the Wobblies, socialists, and white working class. They all came together and they organized by class, not by political ideology or race or religion. They organized by class, and they all came together because they realized they had a common interest against management. And the Roosevelt administration, I think, was willing to help them because I think he recognized that, and that's how he tried to sell it to his fellow elite, was that if you don't give them something, they're going to burn the whole house down and you're going to lose everything. So, and they still didn't buy it. I don't know if you know about the American Liberty League, but that they tried to organize a coup against Roosevelt because they thought he was a communist, and he was going to destroy their influence and their power. And they recruited General Smedley Butler, who played along long enough to figure out what was going on, and then he testified in Congress about it, and they obviously had to back off, and nothing was done about it, but they never tried a coup again, as far as I know, against Roosevelt.
Well, then, let me interrupt you for a second because we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I want to have you come back, okay? And I'm sorry I yelled at you. I'm sorry. I've been a little passionate, a little more passionate today than I usually am, and I apologize to our guest, Richard Otto, who's written these great books. He's a very, very brilliant guy. But now, do you believe that Trump's attempt to stay in power was a coup attempt, January 6th?
No.
No?
I think January 6th was a bunch of people that were upset with the system. They felt the system was rigged against them. There may have been a few people there that felt the election was stolen from them, and who knows?
But then what about the plan with the fake?
Obviously, the Supreme Court prevented the votes being recounted in Florida in 2000. I think Al Gore, if the votes had been recounted, he would have won. I think George Bush stole 2 elections. So, Hillary Clinton claimed the Russians stole the election in 2016, which I think is BS. And, I mean, they're a convenient boogeyman for us. Whenever we have a problem, we blame the Russians. But
wait, there's no doubt that the Russians hacked into the DNC Podesta's emails. And I believe, by the way, too, that Hillary threw that election. It's a detailed theory. But that Putin contacted her and says, hey, we have this dirt on you. You're going to have to throw the election. And she did. Because everyone was talking about that they had this big, giant smoking gun, Stone. And by the way, Stone stole that election, too. He stole the one in 2000, and he stole the one January 6th. But what you said, but January 6th was just a bunch of, upset housewives. What about the fake electors and all that kind of stuff? And they stole a voting machine in Colorado. What about all that?
Well, I mean, they have a lot of problems, and in my books, I recommend going back to paper ballots.
Oh. They print out the machines we have now. Print out a paper ballot. That's the paper ballots. That's not a solution.
Yeah, but the machines can be altered and hacked into. The CIA can hack. If you know something about Vault 7, they can get into any computer system and cover their tracks. And they can do that with your computer in your cars. They can make the car go faster, slow it down, and so it's pretty scary what they're able to do. And they're also able, if they break into computers, they hack into computers, they're also able to synthetically put fingerprints of 5 countries. You know which one of the countries are that they can leave behind their fingerprints? Is Russia. And WikiLeaks disclosed all this, and that's one of the reasons John Brennan was so pissed at him and embarrassed by the whole thing, because I believe Lucifer 2.0, who was, I think he was, or whoever that entity was a FBI or CIA or combination. They created that person, and they synthetically tainted one of the documents with Russian fingerprints. And that's the Mueller report. That's how they linked the hacking, is through Lucifer 2.0. They have no other evidence, nothing. 500 pages, and that's the only thing is they link it, and they don't even discuss what Lucifer 2.0 is. And I think, and some other CIA people like Ray McGovern, Professor Cohen, who was an expert on Russia, Larry Johnson, former CIA, they believe that Lucifer 2.0, their suspicion.
Yeah, but Roger Stone,
an intelligence creation.
Yeah, there's material out there with Roger Stone negotiating with Lucifer 2.0.
No, Roger Stone is, in my opinion, he's a self-serving political hack who ingratiates himself and tries to interject himself to make himself more relevant than he really is. For example, and I hope I don't offend any of your listeners or you, Ed.
Don't worry.
He wrote a book blaming the assassination of John Kennedy on Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
Lyndon Johnson didn't have the guts or the knowledge of how the intelligence community worked to do what they needed to do in order to make that happen. And I think he was involved in the cover-up, but I think, as David Talbot pointed out in the Devil's Chessboard, and as John Newman pointed out in his book, Oswald and the CIA, that James Angleton and Alan Dulles were the people that put that whole thing together. And as Jim Garrison said, there were 3 tiers. There were the sponsors, Richard Helms, James Angleton, Alan Dulles, and other deep state actors who were not really sure. But Alan Dulles, as David Talbot said, it was not a rogue player. He basically acted on behest of his clients. And he was a member of Sullivan and Cromwell. He was a senior partner there. That was the largest Wall Street law firm for decades. And he knew everybody. And I also think that General Curtis LeMay had foreknowledge that something was going to happen, and that's why there was all those shenanigans about where he was that day. Was he in Canada or was he in Michigan hunting? You know, all that stuff. And then, of course, there were the middle people, the people that watched over Lee Harvey Oswald, like David Atlee Phillips, George Ioannidis, and the people that they assigned to do it, like George Diamira-Schultz and Ruth and Michael Payne. And then you had the shooters that William Harvey was in control of, which we can all debate who they are because we don't really know. But I think William Harvey basically was the one that recruited the shooters. And there may have been some mobsters involved in that, too, because we know that, for example, that Jack Ruby worked for the mob. Marcello, he was involved in his whole network in the South. And he's the one that obviously took out the patsy. Lee Harvey Oswald.
You know what? We're running out of time. But I did want to throw in there that, of course, Stone would blame it on LBJ because he's friends with all those Watergate burglars and assassins who are part of shooters.
Yeah.
Okay. And I really wanted to hit you on this thing about Lieben Good and his father being involved with Manafort and Stone and the suicide of January 6th. But anyway, we don't have time for any of that. We got about 1 minute left. What would Richard Alexander Otto like to leave us with? And I'll mention the books, but what would you like to leave us with in 1 minute?
I think that secrecy in our government is destroying what's left of our republic. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to live in a dystopian world, much like was set out by Aldous Huxley in The Brave New World or George Orwell's 1984. Because as Thomas Paine, I believe it was Thomas Paine, said, if the actions of your rulers are secret, you do not live in a democracy. And most of the things that our government does are classified. And we either have to pry it out of their hands through freedom of information lawsuits, which in many cases they don't win, or we have to hope that there's a whistleblower. That's why WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, we didn't discuss him in freedom of the press.
Well, then let's do that definitely the next time you come back, because I got a problem with Assange, too. And he was definitely in the bag for Trump. There's communications that he was, and he said it. I want to trick people into thinking I'm fair. So Julian Assange gets no pass from me. Richard Alexander Otto. Now, you could find Richard in 3 books here. Rethinking America, Lies Masquerading as Truth. Another one is The Hidden War, Desecration of the Promise of America. Another one is The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, How Secrecy and Security Diminish Our Liberty and Threaten Our Democratic Republic. And as you can hear, he's a very well-spoken man. He's done a lot of research. Richard Alexander Otto. One of them is under Richard Alexander Otto. The others are under Richard Otto. You can find them on Facebook. There's 3 groups on Facebook, 3 pages, which the title of each of these books. You could check them out on That's Enough Out of You. That's what these guys probably, that's what Richard Brown is probably saying to me. That's enough out of you, Ed. That's enough out of you.
Yeah.
With Bill
I just want to take this time to thank you, Ed, for having me on your show. It was very gracious of you. And I appreciate your passion. I support your passion. Whether we agree or not agree on a specific issue, that doesn't bother me at all. That's what a democratic republic is all about. The free discourse, being able to disagree and to argue without fear of being censored.
Yeah, or being offended and insulting each other. So I really do appreciate your appearance here today. Richard Alexander Otto, or Richard Otto on Amazon. Thank you so much, my friend.
You're welcome.
Good night.